because they're going extremely slowly so as many people as possible can see. So it's going to be well over an hour, I believe, until they get to Windsor.
This is fine planning by, well, the Queen would have had a say in it, of course, and also the Duke of Norfolk, the Old Marshal, who is responsible overall for the ceremonial. She will have talked about it in many meetings, I guess, over the years, but whether she would like this or that, it's her decision to have a piper to pipe her out of Westminster Abbey. And so she will have said, no, I don't want to go on the motorway. I want to go through the towns between London and Windsor and the streets so that people can see me.
Looks very quiet in Windsor right now. Let's check on the atmosphere there, because Rory Challens is there for us. Rory, can you tell us what it feels like there now?
As you say, very quiet at the moment. They are prepared here for huge crowds. Where I'm standing at the moment with this glorious backdrop, the castle in the distance over my shoulder, this is the excess crowd area. The main bulk of the crowd is going to be lining the long walk, that road up to the castle. They're expecting perhaps 100,000 people to be lining that route. They have segmented the route off into areas each for 10,000 people per segment on both sides of the route. Now, why have they done that? Well, at the funeral of Prince Philip, they had crowd issues here with people trying to bunch up essentially at the castle end. They don't want a repeat of that, so they're putting in place some extra crowd controls. They have a space for another 70,000 or so here where I'm standing, and the crowds that congregates in this spot will be able to watch the proceedings on big screens. Now, Windsor Castle, of course, one of the Queen's favourite palaces. It's, going back.
You see the coffin continuing to travel through West London over a railway bridge right now. That's the only reason there aren't crowds there. It would be impossible. I think actually they're on the overpass, aren't they? Yeah, I think they're on the overpass. Crowds can't go there, although there are some on the one side you can see. Most of this journey, though, to Windsor is going through urban areas, and that means that people will be able to watch, and everywhere we've seen until this moment when they've gone over that overpass, there have been crowds, really large crowds, watching this final moment. Simon, as a military man, what are your feelings, given that you don't serve the Prime Minister, you don't serve the government if you're in the British military, you serve the Queen?
Yes, we really take huge pride in being Her Majesty's Armed Forces. I think the security of the country, the primary responsibility of any government, and it is Her Majesty's government, is the defence of the country, and to be raised above, I say, the cut and thrust of daily politics is actually very reassuring to us. But it does make for that very, very personal connection. She's obviously the Queen of all her subjects, everyone, but I think it is important that the military have a centrality in marking her demise, because the sovereign is there to guarantee the stability of the country in many ways, and the armed forces guarantee the security on her or his behalf. And so I think, again, it's been very educative, this whole last 10 days, to just demonstrate to people how this extraordinary country hangs together. And so we do genuinely, certainly in the officer corps, and I think among our soldiers, sailors and airmen, as they get more senior, get the sort of God, Queen and country, or now God, King and country. And it's what really underpins us, and I think allows our soldiers, sailors and airmen to do the extraordinary things that they do. I think it puts a really extraordinary backbone, emotional backbone, personal backbone into our service to the country. But we do it through our loyalty and allegiance to the monarch.
We're well out of central London now. We're going through the streets of West London, but still, as you can see, there are a great number of people lining the routes. Well, historian Ed Owens, have you noticed a slight difference in the atmosphere since the procession has moved away in the hearse? Certainly we seem to have 3 cheers at one point, we have cheering, we have clapping. Is this different, do you think, from the way these things have been done in the past?
Well, at the top of today's programme, in fact, I said I'd be interested in seeing how the crowds behaved, whether there would be sort of cause for rejoicing, celebration, commemoration of the life, or whether the crowds would be more sort of mute and mournful. What we've seen is both. In central London, in the lead up to the ceremony, during the ceremony itself, clearly the crowds appeared as though they were deeply moved by the experience. And the mood was sombre and reflective. What we've seen since the hearse has left central London is, I think, that desire to celebrate this long reign as it's passed by the groups that have massed at the side of the road. So I think we're seeing both things, and I think Christopher said before that what we're about to see on the arrival in Windsor is probably a return to the more sombre mood as the second part of today's funerary ritual gets underway. So it is fascinating to see how the crowds are reacting. I don't think this is necessarily different to what we've seen past times. What I am left wondering, the more that I've watched today, is whether we're ever going to see the like of this again. I think it highly unlikely that we will ever see a royal funeral on this scale, with this level of grandeur, with such a central role of both the military, the Commonwealth realms. It will, of course, depend on the reign of King Charles III and what sort of king he is, but without wanting to sound it all down.
The Order of the Garter, founded in 1348 by Edward III. So history here, just as in Westminster Abbey, history here is present for this momentous afternoon.
Well, I'm joined now in our studio by the very well-known face, the gardener and broadcaster, Alan Titchmarsh. Thank you very much for taking the time, especially since this is a personal day for you too, because you knew the Queen, you met her on very many occasions. What are your thoughts today, as you've watched, as we've all watched, almost spellbound by some of those images?
I've been so moved, Kirsty, by the fact that we've all come together, as she said we would, and we must. And there's been this enormous sense of togetherness created for us by our late Majesty, the Queen. And the fact that the streets were so lined, that Westminster Abbey was full of the great and the good, but we were there too, in spirit and in many thousands in person. And she has pulled us all together over the years. And I've felt also an enormous sense of continuity. We all thought, oh my goodness me, what will happen when the Queen goes? The Queen has gone, and yet we're still here. She would have wanted us to be. We now have a king who has taken up the reins seamlessly, spoken beautifully, right the way through. And I feel safe. I feel as though we've all come together to say we're all right. It will be okay. She gave us 70 years on the throne. We've learned from her. We will not disappoint her. We will carry on. We will be positive, and we will remember her with enormous fondness and respect.
I was wondering what you were making of, to me, although of course a state occasion, and indeed there will never be a grander one than that, but I was looking at the wreath on the coffin, so full of colour. I saw rosemaries, hydrangeas, there were dahlias, oak leaves. It seemed to me it was a very, very personal touch, and I just wondered, you, with your gardener's eye, what you made of that.
Our history was in that wreath. There were oak leaves there. There are oak trees in Windsor Great Park that were growing here and were mature when William the Conqueror invaded in 1066. Some of them are still there, still alive. And it's Hearts of Oak, isn't it, that famous military song? The oak leaves, rosemary, as you say, for remembrance, English roses. And the Prince of Wales, as you know, as I know, is a great gardener. And it was his wreath there, his message on there to his mother, who was also a keener gardener than most people would realise.
I didn't know that. I didn't know
she loved small flowers. Lily of the Valley was her favourite flower. She loved primroses. They're sort of humble flowers in a way, rather like Queen Alexandra, who was Edward VII's queen. She liked what she called her poor little flowers, really small little flowers. And it was a great reminder that one of the lasting great legacies from the Queen was the Queen's green canopy.
Yes.
That carries on. It is of small consolation to me that the first words my sovereign ever spoke to me in 1985 at the Chelsea Flower Show, when I did a cottage garden, she said to me, first time she'd ever spoken, I'd ever met her, she said, "Your onions are very small." And she must have seen I was crestful. She went on to say, "I like them small. When they're large, they taste of nothing at all."
She's quite right. Bracingly frank. Then what about what she gave you your MBE when you got your MBE? And people always say, well, you know, I don't really talk about what she said. Well, maybe now, maybe today is the day to talk about what she said. Well, what was the conversation?
Well, I'd had the great joy. It was 2000. It was the millennium, New Year almost, and I'd been given the MBE. And in that January, when I knew I'd got it, I was asked to go to Sandringham to talk to the Sandringham WI. Only about 25 members, and the Queen in the front row. And I remember standing up to address this AGM. The Queen was right in front of me, and I said, "Oh, man, we're awfully close, aren't we?" And so she took hold of the table, the trestle table, and she said, "Yes, you pull, I'll push." And we moved the table. And then I had a lovely time. You know, when you can make the Queen laugh, or when you could make the Queen laugh, and she threw her head back, it was genuine laughter, and the smile that we all know. And then when I came to my investiture in June, I thought, well, I wonder if she'll say anything about it. And I went up and went to my bow, and she said, "Are you busy?" And I thought, I was a bit disappointed, you know, it was a bit general, but I thought, no, she sees a lot of people, she can't remember everything. And I told her what I was doing, television and writing. And at the end, the hand came out, and as she shook my hand, she said, "Well," she said, "you give a lot of ladies a lot of pleasure."
She never did.
Well, I didn't really realise until somebody came up to me and said, "What did she say?" And I said, she said, "What?" And so I was going home in the car with my wife, and I said, "You know, I couldn't make up my mind whether to be buried or cremated. I'd quite like to be buried because I'd like a headstone." And on he said, like Alan Titchmarsh, MBE, 1949 to whatever. He gave a lot of ladies a lot of pleasure, Elizabeth R.
Well, she wasn't wrong, was she, Alan?
No.
Extraordinarily, you saw, as he was then, Prince Charles, the night before he was about to become king. A normal night, a special night? It must have presumably been a special night. Prince Charles was there.
It was at Dumfries House, up in Ayrshire, and I've been an ambassador for the Prince's Trust and Prince's Countryside Fund for a long time. I've also been, since its formation, an ambassador for the Prince's Foundation, which does a huge amount of work, and particularly up in that part of Scotland and around Dumfries House. 12,000 people a year learning all kinds of skills. And I was up there to have a look round, and I saw the Prince in the morning and ran across from London and said hello, and we had a quick chat, and he said, you know, perhaps you could do the estate walk with me tomorrow, which, as it turned out, I couldn't do, but it's another story, isn't it? But we had a dinner in the evening, and it was about 50 people there, so it was quite intimate. And after dinner, we had coffee, and we listened to music. There was a sort of penny whistle and a guitar, and the Prince gave the penny whistle player a bottle of scotch and the guitarist a bottle of champagne, and we all chatted, and at about 11 o'clock, the Prince was working his way around the room to leave. And I happened to be standing by the door, and he shook my hand. He said, "Come for tea sometime." I said, "Lovely. I've known him for a long time." And off he went to bed, and off I went to bed, and I got an early flight in the morning. When I got home, I realised that I'd said goodnight to the King on his last night as Prince of Wales. He had no inkling that night before that anything was untoward.
We're looking at pictures now of the Queen's coffin making its way, as I said, towards Windsor, and we can see there's hardly... Well, there isn't a gap, really. People have come out from their homes, their places of work, if they happen to be working today on this bank holiday, and they are very much making their presence felt. And I think, well, we saw how deep the crowds were in central London. It's no surprise.
It's no surprise at all. It's wonderful that people want to be there, as all those hundreds of thousands who filed through Westminster Hall just wanted to be there, to pay their respects, to say thank you. It's a celebration of a life, as well as a mourning of a passing of a very, very important person to all of us.
Alan Titchmarsh, thank you very much for sharing your wonderful memories and your thoughts on such an important day.
Thank you.
People are gathering on the long walk. Anita Rani is there for us.
I was here last night, Kirsty, and a few people were gathering to bag their spots, to spend their night under the stars to make sure that they got a good position. And what a difference now. The crowds have amassed, all here with one common goal: to witness a moment in history, to watch the procession of Her Majesty the Queen's coffin make the final part of its journey along the Long Walk through to Windsor Castle via the Cambridge Gate, which is behind me. The crowds have come well prepared. They've come with picnics and blankets and chairs, and they've been watching the funeral service on screens that have been erected along the Long Walk. And during the service, it was pin-drop silence, and then everybody rose to their feet during the national anthem. The atmosphere here is calm, it's contemplative, it's reflected, it's very peaceful. And the weather gods are smiling on us today. It was warm and overcast this morning, and now the sun has come out. And the people here are from all over the country, all walks of life, young and old, and locals from Windsor as well. Some of them who were lucky enough to meet the Queen, who was very much their neighbour, and I'll be hearing their stories a little bit later.
With me now, watching events unfold today, is the very eminent historian, Sir David Cannadine. We're very happy to have you here. Why Windsor? Why does it end here for Queen Elizabeth II?
It ends here because Windsor is the oldest residence, royal residence of the royal family, going back to Norman times. And more recently, and there's a long perspective here, it's the place where all British monarchs have been buried since George III. Most of them, not all of them, in the chapel here, but all of them within the wider curtilage of Windsor. So it is the place where monarchs finally come to rest, and in the sequence of monarchs, it's now Queen Elizabeth's turn.
Can we draw any conclusions from the fact? I think people very often, when they visit Windsor, when they think of Windsor, they think of Queen Victoria. They see the wonderful statue that's in the centre of Windsor, and of course the mausoleum is here, this grand mausoleum that was built near Frogmore Cottage. Yes, yeah. Near Frogmore. Our longest serving monarch of 70 years doesn't seem to be doing anything that is quite as much of a statement as that. She will be laid to rest in the very intimate privacy of the family crypt. That tells us something about, or does it tell us something about her?
Well, Windsor Castle is a very multifunctional place. It's important to remember that. It began as a fortress, it's a royal home, it's where many members of the royal household work, it has a fabulous library and art collection, and it's a place of worship. So lots of things go on in Windsor, but one of the great things that goes on, which is why we're here today, is that this is where monarchs end their lives and are buried here. Queen Elizabeth, of course, herself had a strong personal connection with Windsor, probably stronger than many monarchs before her, so there are many reasons why it's very fitting that she ends here.
Do you think the strong connection, particularly being the teenage years during the war, which really sort of cemented, would it be fair to say, cemented her relationship with the place?
I think it would. Of course, even before that, she spent weekends and time at Royal Lodge when her father was Duke of York, and that's where she acquired her love of country living and dogs and horses. But then, of course, she did live here with Princess Margaret during the Second World War. She made her first broadcast from here. And I think that was a very influential phase in her life. When she became monarch, she spent weekends here during the time that she was at Buckingham Palace during the week, and a variety of events are built around Windsor, the Garter ceremony, for example, Ascot Week, and of course a great deal of royal pageantry goes on here, state occasions when she welcomed people like President Obama or Donald Trump or Joe Biden. So she was very closely associated with here during her very long reign.
Can we think then about today as the moment when the Queen slips from being the person who was our monarch into history, as it were? You know, she is somebody who people will now be reading about. That's a very significant moment, of course, for her family and friends, but in a way it's a shared moment for all of us.
Yes, I think that's right, and in a way it's a moment that will actually linger. It is true that she is passing from being our queen, and most of us never knew the time when there was any other monarch. She has now passed into history. We have a new sovereign, King Charles III. But of course it's true, firstly, that I think many people will remember this day all their lives. But secondly, it's going to take quite a while for my colleagues, historians and biographers, to reach some settled verdict on many aspects of her reign. We know already it was a remarkable reign. She was a great monarch and was much loved. All of that we know and is settled. But how future generations, future historians will come to see her is, I think, something that will need a lot of work on going forward.
It is very interesting that she maintained, entirely consistently as I understand it, the popularity of the monarchy throughout her reign. The figures were always the same. You know, people very much liked her when she came to the throne and very much like her today. It's interesting that as times have changed, and in many ways she was a monarch managing decline of an empire, decline of Britain's status in the world in so many ways, and yet every overseas paper that I got my hands on this morning, on its very front page was the fact that today was the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. It's interesting that there's a sort of tension between those two things, do you think?
Yes, I think that's right. It's clear that in many ways she presided over a period of de-imperialisation, for want of a better word.
It's a good word.
And de-Victorianisation, if you'd like that one as well. And part of her skill at managing that was that she never let on that that was what she was doing.
Yes.
And I think that was crucially important. Yet at the same time as those things were happening, she helped the monarchy adapt. Some thought too slowly, some thought too quickly. I think on the whole she called it right. And I think the recognition that she managed to sustain all of that over 70 years was a very extraordinary achievement. Just as is also the fact that, although we like to think to the contrary, over 70 years she sustained the fact that with very, very few exceptions, we never really knew what she thought about anything.
Isn't that true? And that's so often when I speak to people, indeed at the Jubilee I spoke to many people to try to get an insight, but I suppose it's understandable that somebody who was so constantly under scrutiny would want very firmly to keep part of their life private.
I think that's right, and the hope must be, I speak here of course as a historian, the hope must be that she did indeed keep a diary, which I think there is cause to suppose that she did, and let us hope that she expressed her views there trenchantly and candidly in a way that in public she very properly felt she couldn't.
So interesting to talk to you, Sir David Cannadine. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
It's been a great pleasure and privilege.
Thank you.
On its way from London to Windsor, the coffin of the Queen carried past large crowds on each side of the road here. Quite extraordinary that in the centre of London people were kept away from the procession, and they're making up for it by coming here in their thousands, not just here but at Windsor, down the Long Walk, on each side. This is the road that runs right the way down from the castle to a statue in the far distance. You can just see on the skyline of George III. And Queen Anne had it paved for a carriage. Each side it looks as though those are flower beds. They're not flower beds. They're flowers that have been laid by the gardeners of Windsor, that have been brought here by thousands of people over the last few days. They've been coming up the hill to the castle, each carrying just a small bouquet, obeying orders, not having it wrapped in cellophane or anything like that, and placing them here, and then the gardeners putting them into a pattern so they look like a planted garden, with sunflowers particularly strong for this time of year. The gates at the bottom are the Cambridge Gate, and this part is private, and this is where the coffin will be brought up towards the castle itself. And when it reaches the top, the Queen, the King and other members of the royal family will join the coffin of the Queen and accompany it from the top of the castle, from the round tower, where the Royal Standard's now flying, not at half-mast. The Royal Standard never flies at half-mast. It's being hoisted to the top of the flagpole to show that King Charles has just arrived. It was at half-mast when it was the Union flag before, but it stays there while the King is present. And so they will walk down through to what's called the lower ward, to St George's Chapel itself, where the service will take place. And as they come up that long walk, you'll hear a minute gun firing, just as it was in London. The Royal Horse Artillery firing a gun every minute, and 5 seconds after the gun fires, 2 bells ring. One from the chapel itself, just below the chapel, and the other a famous bell called the Sebastopol bell. It was captured in the Crimean War and only rings for moments like this. It last rang in 2002 for the death of the Queen Mother, and it rang again this week for the death of Her Majesty the Queen. So the route liners are in place. We're waiting now for the arrival of the coffin, and there will be a long procession past those thousands we saw on the long walk.
Well, someone who knows Windsor Great Park very well and was looking closely at those beautiful images is the equestrian event organiser Simon Brooks Ward. And it's not just the Great Park, but indeed the Queen herself that you knew very well and you worked closely with throughout the years on the Windsor Horse Show. You are going to the service today. You are that good a friend, and therefore we're very grateful that you've taken the time on what I'm sure is a very difficult day for you. What are your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I've given 1 or 2 interviews over the last week or so, and you know, every time I come away, I can't believe I'm talking in the past tense about the Queen. Even now, I have trouble thinking that the Queen is finally gone, and I hope that this afternoon there'll be time for reflection and a little bit of closure and also understanding it and grieving as well. Over the past days, of course, what we hear so often is she was a country woman at heart, and we try to in a way get to the bottom of that, and one of the ways to unpack it, of course, is her relationship with horses, the equestrian fraternity. It all began with a little pony called, was it Peggy? Peggy. Tell me a bit about Peggy. Well, Peggy is a little Shetland pony, and as we know, they can be either great or they can be really curmudgeonly. And I think Peggy was okay actually, but she had a really big instructor called Sybil Smith, who was one of these sort of redoubtable women who got the Queen riding and interested in ponies from the very beginning. And that connection, you know, with an animal like a horse or a pony, it doesn't matter whether you're a queen or a pauper or whatever, it's the connection, they don't know it, and the Queen had a wonderful connection with horses. And I wonder maybe, Simon, that was really at the root of it, because horses and dogs, she loved horses and dogs, and of course they just met her on the same terms as they met any human being. You know, they weren't looking at the crown, they weren't looking at the orb and the sceptre, she was just another human being, and I wonder maybe if therein lay part of the attraction for her. Absolutely, it was simple pleasures, and you know, when you're getting away from matters of state and you're dealing with your dogs or your horses or the surroundings that you're in, it was tremendously relaxing for the Queen, and that's what we saw at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. Absolutely, the total relaxation for the Queen to come down and see her horses and ponies, which she did for 79 years. 79 years? Yeah. She never missed one? Never missed one, and was there most days. And recently, the State Opening Parliament happened on the Wednesday. Well, I don't know how the Queen did it, but the Queen took off the crown, the robes of state and everything else, and was here by lunchtime to see her ponies in the ring. It was amazing. And she was a very accomplished horsewoman herself. Is it true, and I've read this and I've never been able to check it out with anybody else, I guess you're the person to ask, was she still riding her fell ponies into her early 90s? Oh yes. That's true? Yes, it's true. And the Queen was a fantastic horsewoman and person, and I always say that nobody knows or knew as much about a horse or a pony than the Queen. She had an incredible encyclopedic memory about horses and what breeding lines and bloodlines and everything else. So she loved them. Did they love her? Was the feeling mutual? Oh yeah. we all knew that the Queen was not very tall, and sometimes these big horses are not well behaved, sometimes. But with the Queen, she absolutely commanded them. And it was done because it was relaxed. She stood there, she stood her ground, and the Queen tended to have this relationship with it, which is extraordinary. It was almost horse whispering.
Really?
Yeah, it was amazing to see the Queen around horses.
June, of course, means Ascot, and she was a devoted attendee of Ascot. It's interesting to think about the work that she did. I mean, obviously, it was enjoyment for her, but she brought the racing fraternity really into the spotlight, and we have, I guess, the amount of overseas money and the people who are very interested and want to be part of horse racing because they associate it with something dignified and something wonderful, and they associate it with the monarchy. She did a lot for the industry of racing.
Industry of racing, industry of horses and ponies. I mean, the Queen didn't just have a horse and see it race. The Queen knew about its journey, you know, from foal to the winning post. And that gave a great sense of accomplishment and pleasure for the Queen. And it was the same with the horses and ponies. And I always say to people that there are rare breeds in ponies and horses. And she was responsible for saving at least 7 through her patronage and support that we now see today not only survive, but they're thriving as well, like the Highland pony.
Now, never mind winning the Gold Cup with Estimate in 2013. I hear she liked to win the rosettes at the Royal Windsor Horse Show. She was chuffed, was she, when she got one?
Really great pleasures. And I remember wandering up to the Queen, and she just stood there in her blue gilet and a headscarf and sensible shoes and a tweed skirt.
Good woman.
And you know, so she was pretty incognito. And I remember wandering up to one ring, and she'd had a real sort of blue ribbon day, because you hauled out this load of rosettes out of her pocket and said, "Simon, look what I've won." And you know, she was so pleased, and her smile was radiant. And she put them on her dining room table every night. Every time she won a cup at Royal Windsor Horse Show or a rosette, she put it on the dining room table.
Simon Brooks-Ward, we are very grateful for you sharing those wonderful, intimate memories. We will let you go now to St George's Chapel. Thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you very much indeed.
I am with not just any old Windsor family, 6th generation Windsor family. Geoffrey, lovely to see you.
Thank you very much.
You're 90 now, but during the war, you got a very special invite to Windsor Castle, didn't you?
I did, yes, absolutely. I was invited
to go and see
the pantomime.
The pantomime.
Oh yes, yeah, the pantomime. I went to see the pantomime, which was absolutely amazing. It was fantastic.
How old were you?
I was 8 years of age.
8 years old. And who was in the pantomime?
The pantomime, well, I want to call them Princess Elizabeth and Princess Anne.
Margaret.
Princess Margaret.
We're with you. Well, there were princesses then.
Yeah, they were the princesses, that's right. Because it's a long time ago, but I think I'm probably the only person that's ever been to there, because I was taken, and I was so enthusiastic about it because it was so wonderful. I went round and picked up the programmes, and I talked to the princesses, and they talked to me.
What did you talk about? Do you remember?
Yes, they just said, "Hi, you know, what are you doing? How are you about?" And I said, "Well, did you enjoy doing it?" And they said, "Oh, absolutely, we loved it."
What a lovely memory and an experience. Can we see the mementos that you've got in your hand? So what do we have here? We've got tickets to see Aladdin.
Yeah.
And a letter sent, and your tickets came in this letter. How did you manage to get the tickets?
Well, my parents knew the headmaster there of the Royal School, who in fact produced the pantomimes.
And Andrew, you've been hearing these stories your whole life.
Oh, all my life, yes.
How special?
Incredibly special, and sort of rooted my father at such a young age to the whole Windsor royal connection.
And you've got your own royal connection as well, haven't you?
I do, Anita.
Story.
I am chairman of the Royal Windsor Rose and Horticultural Society, and the society was founded by Queen Victoria in 1893, and every sovereign since then has been our patron. Now, I'm not chairman because I'm a gardener. In fact, I know nothing about gardening or horticulture at all, but the society got in trouble about 10 years ago with no members, and I was approached because my grandfather had been involved, and I was asked if I would help them out. And I'm a businessman, so together with the small team, we've managed to, reignite the society.
And you took a bouquet to the Queen?
I did. In fact, the summer show, the Royal Windsor Flower Show, has a unique competition class, which is a floral table display that the winner gets, the table display goes up to Her Majesty's breakfast table. And so as chairman, my job is to go up to the Windsor Castle, knock on the door, present the floral display, say, Andrew Try, chairman of the Royal Windsor Rose and Horticultural Society, the floral display for Her Majesty's breakfast table.
And the Queen was there, and she actually invited you up to see the roses.
Exactly. So I was invited in.
Wonderful.
I wasn't expecting it, and got to present the bouquet to the Queen.
Wonderful to hear both your stories. Thank you so much, Geoffrey and Andrew. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks, Anita. There's a documentary in that. My next guest is the actress and writer Dame Maureen Lipman. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. You were preparing to go on stage 11 days ago when you heard the news that stopped so many of us in our tracks. How did you react?
I had a premonition, Kirsty. I actually texted to a friend in Corrie. I think the Queen's going to die. Just had one of those strange experiences, and then I thought that the show would be cancelled. It was in Manchester, it was a one-woman show, and I didn't think anyone would play that night, but the directive came through that we were all to carry on. And all I can say is it's quite a harrowing show as well as humorous, but all I can say is it was very tender that night, because my reaction was immediately visceral. I just sobbed. And then literally the show had to go on.
You met the Queen, I mean, we talked about this at the Jubilee just a little bit. I mean, you met the Queen on six occasions. I mean, that's quite a lot of times to meet the Queen.
For a whole girl.
Yes, especially for a whole girl. How would you describe her when you go beyond what she very obviously was?
She's in her own skin. She's absolutely herself. She's a modest and a shy person, playing the part of somebody absolutely in charge of everything, as she was today.
Yes.
Because wasn't it beautifully?
Absolutely
Beautifully directed. You, of course, are not in your own skin, so you're just basically burbling. And I've burbled my way through at least 6 or 7 occasions. And I suppose I remember particularly the night she came to Oklahoma, which was her favourite show because I think she saw it on honeymoon. And so we, the cast of Oklahoma, were all called in for a 10:30 rehearsal in the morning, which is pretty unheard of. We've been playing for 6 months, Hugh Jackman and all the rest of us. And she came in the morning and we erected a barn and sang, "Oh, the farmer and the cowman should be friends," you know. And then that night, she came to see the show. Lunchtime, we had a lunch with her at the Ivy, just a few of us. And I didn't get to speak to her because I wasn't next to her. But as I left, she said to me, "I believe you're coming to see us at the Palace quite soon." And I said, "Yes, Ma'am, if I can find something to wear," you know, normally witty riposte, you know, blah, blah, blah. And that was in November. And in February, in my nice outfit, I'd made my little bob, and she said, "Well, I see you found something."
She did not.
She did.
I think that's extraordinary.
It is. She was an extraordinary woman, and we've lost the mother yeast of our daily bread, is how I put it. We've lost. Well, since she knew that it was a more important meeting to us than it was to
inevitably,
her.
yes.
She was dazzling in every way, and so photogenic. She couldn't take a bad photograph, could she?
She had the best. I only met her once, but the best skin I have ever seen. She was lit from within. I think.
She was, and she made that job into. You know, when you think of her courage, her sheer courage. Queen Victoria shut herself away for decades after the death of her beloved. She was out there again after a week, and the mundanity of the job, the boxes every day,
Yes.
you know, not like in the...
A procession very like the one we saw in London, with the pipes and the drums and the bands and all that sort of glorious jewel-like surrounding of the coffin as they come up the long walk and into this west door, under the huge window, one of the largest stained glass windows in Britain. And the coffin will be borne up the steps and into the nave. The music's going to be played. It's interesting, the music they're going to play. There's one particular composer who was the organist here at the chapel, who not only played the organ here, but has also provided music for the service itself. And he was here from the 30s until the 60s. The Queen herself used to go up into the organ loft there to listen to him play. And it's said that he actually taught Her Majesty the piano. Sir William Harris is called. But there's music also by Bach and Herbert Howells, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, modern music from Judith Weir, the current master of the King's Music, Elgar Vaughan Williams, all those famous British composers. But for the moment, it seems they sit in silence and just talk to each other. The banners of the Knights of the Garter. Now, interestingly, the 1000th Knight of the Garter, would you believe, was the Prince of Wales, who was Prince William then. He was appointed in 2008, the 1000th Knight of the Garter. It goes back centuries. And it's in the gift, or was in the gift of the sovereign, only given to people who've distinguished themselves in public life. Not all men. There are women, ladies of the Garter, they're called as well. And their banners hang here during their time when they're alive, when they come every year to this service here for the Garter, and then on their death the banner's taken down, but the seat that they have below in the choir, those brass plaques you can see, are there to commemorate their time as members of the order. There are 700 or 800 of them left here. Some have been taken down because history disapproved of them, others have just fallen down. But otherwise, this extraordinary panoply of the Knights of the Garter, whose chapel this is. And the man responsible for all this is the most senior herald, Garter King of Arms, who made the principal proclamation of the King in St. James's Palace earlier this week. And here today will perform one of his final duties, which is to read out the Queen's styles and titles at the very end of the service. Garter King of Arms, and with the heralds, who nowadays play a mainly symbolic role at state occasions, but in the past were figures of controversy who had to decide who was entitled to call themselves what and who owned what land, and got caught up in all kinds of shenanigans. But now, as so many of the people that we see in the most brilliant colours here, enlivening these occasions, is actually there simply as a formal role which they play.
Archives are.
Right.
And it was an extraordinary joy to read all these letters that had never been written, probably since they were never been read for 50, 60 years.
But didn't you spend time consulting with the Queen and saying, this is what I've found and what do you make of that and is that accurate? So you would take tea with her and you would exchange your research and ask for her opinion?
Yes, she would ask me to tea either here or sometimes at Balmoral, if that was, my wife and I went to stay there several times. But you're right, and I would say, look at this letter, ma'am, do you remember this? And she would say, oh yes, this is why I wrote that, or this is why my mother wrote this to me, or to so-and-so. So I got to know her. I was, as I say, very privileged and lucky to do so.
I mean, you're a very distinguished writer, but that must have been quite nerve-wracking.
It was, but nerve-wracking in theory, but actually the first time after I'd met her, I realized what an extraordinarily kind and gentle person she was, and she always put everybody at their ease. There was never any side to her. It was always gentle and wise and incredibly decent in every sense of the word.
So you had access to this archive, and there were letters between the Queen and the very young Queen and the Queen Mother. I need to ask you a question that has been bothering me because I've read it in 2 or 3 books, which is, during the war, did the Queen Mother sign her letters tinkety-tonk?
Tinkety-tonk and down with the Nazis.
Right.
And she had this wonderful habit of raising her glass to people she loved and say, let's now drink to Winston Churchill. And then raise our glasses to Winston Churchill, and let's lower our glasses to the Nazis. And others.
When you were a house guest, you say both here at Windsor, overnight stay, what were they called? Dine and sleeps, I think.
Dine and sleep.
Very posh sleepover.
Yeah, yes, very posh, of course. Being asked to sleep here is very posh. One of the other guests who was there the night that my wife and I were here had a canaletto in his bedroom. Well, that's pretty posh.
That is pretty posh.
Right. And beautiful.
And those events, I mean, I imagine, of course, because you already had this working relationship, not entirely nerve-wracking, but, you know, you have to be careful to do and say the right thing. Notoriously, we have heard throughout this week that the Queen was the consummate hostess, that she worked very hard to put her house guests at their ease. Did you experience that?
Absolutely. There was one classic occasion when my wife and I were coming to stay the night, or the weekend actually, and the British Airways lost my wife's luggage. So she was crestfallen, as you can imagine.
I can.
But we arrived, and the Queen came to the door and said, I hear you've lost your luggage. I'm terribly sorry. But I've tried to arrange with the other ladies' guests and ladies in waiting and others to find some clothes for you. And so they did. And my wife had a very nice shirt from a lady in waiting and a skirt from someone else and a beautiful belt from a Polish maid.
Wonderful.
So it was fantastic.
Tell me then what your thoughts were today when you were watching the service, and what, I mean, not necessarily what do you expect them to be, but what is your sort of state of mind as somebody who is saying goodbye to somebody who was dear to them and who they knew?
I think the whole thing has been quite astonishingly...
With Jim Motherwell, who was appointed Piper to the Sovereign in 1997. What does that mean, Jim? What was the job?
The role of the job, you play the bagpipes every morning underneath the Queen's window from 9 till 9:15. Then you pack them away. Then you go and collect the Queen when she comes down from her private apartments at the lift, and you just stay with her, regarding what she's doing, interviews, visits, investitures. You basically work all day with her. And then when you're finished, you take her back round to the lift and she goes back upstairs to her private apartment.
What an incredible job to have.
It was very surreal.
Every single day you would play a tune on the bagpipe, same tune every day?
No, you had not to repeat the tunes all week, and you get a lot of tunes into 15 minutes on the bagpipes.
Did you ever get requests?
Yeah, the Queen's got her favourite tunes, a lot of them. A couple that Pipe Major Burns, who's the present Queen's Piper, played today. And she used to ask for a tune called Dovecote Park because she remembered it from she was a princess at the end of the war.
And then you go up to Balmoral as well?
Balmoral's the best part of the year because I've got loads of duties, or I had loads of duties to do at Buckingham Palace. But once you get up to Balmoral, you play the bagpipes. In the morning, you play at dinner in the evening, and during the day, you would go out horse riding, shooting, practicing your military training in case you ended up back in the regiment.
Not a bad life.
Yeah,
now,
okay.
One of the most poignant moments in the funeral service was when the Piper played.
Oh, that was for me big time, because the Piper, Pipe Major Paul Burns, he's a very good player, but he's young and he's... I remember what that feeling was like, and I was more nervous for him today than I was when I played the Queen Mother out the church when she passed away nearly 20 years ago.
He did an amazing job, though.
He did a fantastic job.
So if I were to ask you one enduring memory of the Queen, what would it be?
My wife was hurt in an accident at work in London, and she was quite badly hurt. And I had to take time off, compassionate time off, and then when I went back to work, the Queen asked how my wife was and how she was coping. And I said, there's no long-term injuries, but she's covered in bruises. So the Queen said, wait there. She went back upstairs in the lift, came back down and gave me a little bottle of Anika to put on my wife's bruises. So Trish was very happy with that.
Such compassion.
Yeah, that's the word, compassion. She's a very compassionate lady.
Well, it's been a real pleasure to hear your memories. And what does it mean to be here today, Jim?
Oh, it's very special. I mean, when I saw on the news and the TV that the Queen had died, that's all it said, the Queen dies. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but this is lovely doing this, seeing all this, the pageantry. It just brings my job back into the forefront of my head again.
Jim, thank you very much.
You are very welcome.
Beautiful memories. Well, there is a unique bond between the monarch and the armed forces, of course. To tell us more, I am joined by Sir Sebastian Roberts, former Major General of the Household Division, and Sir David Cannadine has joined us again. Thank you to you both. Sir Sebastian, if I can come to you first of all, what are your thoughts on a day like today?
Well, as you just said, there is a unique bond between the armed forces and the the monarchy and the monarch. And I think for all of us who've had the honour to serve our Queen, now King, and country, that bond is special. I think, of course, at the same time, that we all, at the time of a funeral, we're on the brink of eternity. We're on that moment that will come to all of us, and which in the military one I suppose confronts by virtue of one's service, one's own mortality and that of others. And I think we always knew that the Queen, as part of her service, had a great consciousness of the eternal verities, the things that do face us all, at the same time as being a deeply human individual. And that was the other side of being fortunate enough to be a guardsman, that one had the opportunity quite often to see the deep humanity, the person, as well as the image that we all knew and served.
And how did that display itself? When did you see it at its greatest?
In so many ways and on so many occasions. I can remember here in Windsor, one year after the grand military horse race meeting at Sandown, the Queen followed her mother, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, in giving a party afterwards. And one year, several people who had been bad, "What will you do?" And he said, "It doesn't really matter, ma'am, as long as it's serving people less well off than myself." And, well, as you can perhaps imagine, her eyes filled with tears. And one realised that any mask was easily laid aside.
And of course she came from a military family through and through. She understood the military in a way that was not simply ceremonial and part of her role as sovereign.
Yeah, absolutely. She certainly felt, I think, at ease with people who had made the same sort of commitment as she had as a young woman. She joined the army, as we all know, in the Second World War, and then found herself with intimate connections to the armed forces, for a start, being the child and the wife of a serving naval officer. I think it's well known how much she enjoyed her life before she became Queen as a naval wife. And I think she so deeply appreciated being surrounded by people who had made that oath of allegiance, which, if you like, binds one to being circumspect, but also sharing those values which she so clearly embodied. Selfless commitment, duty, all those things. I think she clearly lived by and liked being among people who had made the same commitment.
David Cannadine, we are hearing, and I'm sure viewers are hearing it too, the splendid sound, and maybe people can also enjoy the sight of the military as they are marching through and around St Charles Cathedral. And we might think for a moment about some
great deal of military involvement in the funeral so far. And the sense that the funeral of a reigning monarch is in many ways a military funeral dates back in its modern guise to Queen Victoria's time. She wanted a military funeral. She took great pride in being a soldier's daughter. And the gun carriage, which is of course an essential part of what we've seen today, signifies that. It's also the case that because of the slight hitch, to put it no more strongly, in Queen Victoria's funeral, the horses were taken out because they threatened to bolt. And Prince Louis of Battenberg summoned naval ratings to pull the gun carriage up to here. And so the tradition of state funerals having a gun carriage pulled by naval ratings dates back to then, and is a further aspect of the military nature of these last rites of a sovereign who, as Sebastian has pointed out, is of course the head of the armed services.
And we will see something today called, now I hope I get this right, is it called the breaking of the wand?
We shall indeed see the breaking of the wand.
It sounds unlikely, that phrase.
Sounds unlikely.
Can you tell me what it means?
Well, in the first place, we will never have seen this before because no committal or funeral service of a reigning monarch that has taken place at St George's Chapel, Windsor, has ever before been televised. So we shall see the Lord Chamberlain breaking his wand for the first time ever. The Lord Chamberlain has a wand. It's a long staff because in the old days he was the presiding person at court events, and courtiers tended to misbehave and talk rather more loudly than I suspect they do today, and in order to call for appropriate silence he used to bang the wand on the floor, and that was the purpose of having the wand. And what has been traditional for a very long time is that with the death of the sovereign and the service here, at the end of that service, the Lord Chamberlain breaks the wand to signify the ending of one reign and I suppose the beginning of another. So we will see that later today.
For the first time ever.
For the first time ever.
Thank you so much for sharing that, and Sir Sebastian, thank you too for sharing your memories. Lovely to hear them.
And it has to be said, the wand is actually buried with the Queen's coffin. So we'll see it as the coffin disappears from sight in St. George's Chapel. Now the liners are all the way down this long walk. You could see them just fading into the distance. And the coffin will arrive at the far end there and then come up in this procession at the slow walk. The RAF musicians, the Royal College, Royal Air Force College at Cranwell, all the guards lined here, they were all out here on Saturday morning in the pitch dark rehearsing this, and the Royal Hearse in the meantime is about 7 minutes away from us, I think. It's past Runnymede and it's on its way to Windsor, still with people on either side of the street. I'm sure when it actually gets closer to Windsor, judging by the crowds that there have been at Windsor, there'll be thousands more people to greet it. Close to the River Thames as it comes through towards Windsor itself. The tradition of throwing flowers into the road began, I think, with the funeral of Princess Diana, when, you may remember, as you can see on the Royal Hearse now, flowers on the bonnet. There were flowers on the windscreen that had to be wiped away with windscreen wipers. So as we wait for the hearse to come to the castle grounds itself, and then the start of the full procession, let's just get back for a moment to Kirsty.
Joining me now is Bishop Rachel Treweek. Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. I understand you had, now I was reading my notes and it said an audience with Her Majesty when you were taking up your new role. I think that sounds like a terrifying phrase. What was the briefing? How did it go?
Yes, every bishop, when they become a diocesan bishop, goes to pay homage to Her Majesty.
Right.
So go to Buckingham Palace and go into the palace and meet with her and kneel before her. And she put her hands over my hands and I swore allegiance to her.
And how did you have a flutter of nerves? Was it a conversation?
Terrifying.
Were you briefed before? Did they say, this is where you stand?
Yes, I think the thing with me was I was the first female bishop she'd ever received.
Ah.
And so as I stood outside the door, there was a bit of fluttering about whether I should curtsy or bow wearing my robes. And then there came that moment when I was told that I would need to kiss the Bible. The Bible was on a cushion, opened at a verse I'd chosen, and they said, you'll need to kiss the Bible at the appropriate moment. And I said, I can't possibly do that. And people looked at one another rather worried, as if there was some theological reason why I couldn't do that. And I simply said, I'm wearing lipstick. So that was the first time that had happened. So I was asked to put my nose into it.
You were a house guest at Sandringham as well, and I've been talking to guests today about, yes, I mean, that is, I suppose, not only an honour and a treat, but a slightly nerve-wracking set of circumstances. How did you find it?
Yes, and indeed, as a bishop, you're not there as a house guest, you're there as a member of the Queen's household at that time. You're there to preach at Sandringham on the Sunday. And again, a very nerve-wracking experience, but as we've heard so often in recent days, Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth was amazing at making you feel very at home. And I particularly remember her sitting at her card table, playing Patience and sitting next to her. And it really put one at your ease, because you weren't looking eye to eye like this. She was looking down, playing cards and talking, and it was a wonderful thing that she did to make you feel at home.
Something that we've heard very often people saying over the last 10, 11 days is that they felt that the Queen, for 70 years or however many years they had been alive, was this constant, this reassuring presence that was constantly there, that represented continuity. So she did that for the hundreds of thousands of people who queued to see her lying in state. She did it for the millions who watched the lying in state online. I was thinking about where she got her reassurance from and where she got her continuity from, and I'm imagining the answer to that might be her faith, because we are told time and time again that that was absolutely central to who she was.
Absolutely. She was rooted and grounded in her faith in Jesus Christ. And it's interesting you saying, Kirsty, about that constant presence, because even in death, she has been constant till now. People watching the coffin at this very moment, people, thousands of people queuing to be even in her presence in death. And of course now, as we come to the committal, we are acknowledging that that presence will be no more, that we are letting go, but we are letting go of her into eternal life with God. And she believed that, and as a follower of Jesus Christ, I believe that. And I think there's that thing that's been acknowledged again and again about her referring to Christ as the one who came to earth not to be served but to serve, and her service has been noted again and again, and that ability she had to make every person feel very special in that moment. And I would say that's because she knew that her sovereignty was bestowed upon her by God, and yet she was a human being.
Studying much of what she said, and particularly in her Christmas messages, she seemed, as she grew older, to be, I think, bolder about stating her faith and talking about it more openly. Is that something you discerned? Did you feel that? Even though it was always with her, one gets the feeling that she sort of thought, well, I'm not necessarily going to listen to the advisors who might say that's a turn-off, and it is a turn-off for plenty of people. I'm going to simply tell it like it is.
Yes, I think that's true, that she was confident in sharing her faith. Perhaps that did get stronger as she got older, but that sense that she was rooted and grounded in her faith in Jesus Christ, and yet wanted to be there for all people, and people of all faith and no faith. And that sense that she knew that every human being, she believed, as I believe, is created in the image of God and was unique and precious.
We're going to witness again, as we have done day in, day out over the past 11 days, the ritualizing of grief, that somehow that is the thing that the Church has seemed to give us through this period, where we are wondering about what we feel, wondering how we can mark the importance of this momentous passing. The Church has in a way come into its own in that respect, and it has said to us, well, you might be a believer, you might not be a believer, but this is the way we can make sense of a very difficult situation.
Yes, and I would say that in death the Queen has served us, because her death has enabled us to really allow our own stories to resonate with this national story of grief and mourning. Over these last few days, her death has held that space. And I would say, if we see all the flowers, the tributes, people queuing up for hours to pay respects to her, there's something about people's own stories, their own grief, their own pain, being allowed to come to the fore. And today, in this committal service, there will be that finality, that letting go. And I think in that moment, we will acknowledge all the different losses. People will, in their own stories, acknowledge the different losses, their own grief, for friends, for family, things in life that people had wished had been. And that space will be held as we let go of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and as we allow our own pain and our own stories to be held in that moment.
That's such an interesting thought, because that really is essentially about the thing that the Queen relentlessly promoted throughout her life, which was community. That actually community comes together in the good times, but it also comes together in the difficult times. And many people who've spoken about their feelings regarding the Queen's death have said that it reminds me of when.
Yes.
And that seems to have been an important part of this whole 11 days as well.
Absolutely, about community, about the fact that as unique individuals we do belong together. That's also central to Christian faith, that actually the body of Christ we talk about. And in her life and in her death, people are being drawn together. And my hope and prayer is that our remembering won't be mere nostalgia,
yes,
but that it will change us. That as we gather and as we watch this committal service, that each person will ask, what does this mean to me? What will my life be because of this?
That's very interesting. Is that then what you think, because my final question to you really was going to be, I was going to ask you what you think the legacy of this monarch will be. Is that it?
I hope that her faith will be remembered, that it will live on. I hope that it will make people curious. I hope people will be curious about faith, and I hope that that legacy will be that in our differences we come together. So often in our world, we live in a world where difference divides people, and at the heart of the Christian message is we might have differences, but we move towards one another in our differences.
Thank you very much, the Right Reverend Rachel Treweek. Very interesting to talk to you and hear your reflections. Thank you very much. Well, now, as the State Hearse approaches Windsor for the final time, here is David Dimbleby.
Thank you, Kirsty. This empty road now, as the hearse approaches the middle of the long walk that leads up to Windsor Castle. As everywhere the hearse passes, a salute as it goes past. And on the long walk itself, at the bottom end, the guard of honour that will escort it up to the castle is assembling. That little crossing you can see at the bottom of the long walk there with the flowers on either side, that's the Cambridge Gate. We're looking at it from Windsor Castle, and the whole procession will come from the far distance there, right past these throngs of people on either side of this great park. The equerries in uniform there, they're many of them, and they're chosen to stand either side of the coffin. Equerries who served the Queen either at Balmoral or at Windsor or at Buckingham Palace or at Sandringham indeed, and they stand closest to the coffin, and the bearer party on the either side of them, the bearskins drawn from the Queen's company of the 1st Battalion of the Grenadier Guards. Grenadier Guards who were the closest regiment to the Sovereign, the Queen's company particularly close to her. The Grenadier Guards who loyalty to the British Sovereign has never been questioned. So they don't, in practice, ever drink a toast to the monarch, because their loyalty is undoubted. This splendid sight now starting to gather, and it will be very similar but slightly more modest, perhaps is a way of putting it, slightly more intense is another way of thinking of it. The Household Cavalry, a division of the Sovereign's escort, pipes and drums band of the Grenadier Guard, dismounted band of the Household Cavalry. First division of the Sovereign's escort mounted, and before them the dismounted detachment of the Household Cavalry, the Life Guards. And the Queen's company colour, borne by an officer of the Queen's company of the 1st Battalion of the Grenadier Guards, carried in front of the hearse. It's such a strange sight after seeing those processions in London, to see this procession down a country road in all its solemnity, because this is the country, in effect. This is the Queen's coffin coming back to the place that she called home. No crowds here, just walking along this road, this long procession, and then it will turn up and start coming up to the grandeur of the long walk. The minute gun firing every minute, and 5 seconds later, the Sebastopol bell. The heralds have come from the centre of London to take their place in this procession. Absent from this procession at this stage is the royal family. Only when this procession has reached the long walk and has turned and has come up to Windsor Castle will the King and the Queen Consort and the other members of the royal family join in as they were in London. Meanwhile, at the west door of St. George's Chapel, the stepliners, a dismounted step-lining party found by the Household Cavalry Mounted Regiment, is taking up its place, and the clergy of the chapel on the left there. And it's up these steps that the coffin will come when the procession finally reaches this Horseshoe Cloister at the bottom end of the chapel. The clergy, including, you may have noticed, the Archbishop of Canterbury, come from Westminster Abbey. And the other clergy on the left there of the Chapel Royal, the Dean of the Chapel Royal in Scotland, the Rector of Sandringham will be here, the Minister of Crathy Church, or Crathy Kirk, perhaps I should call it, Reverend Kenneth Mackenzie will be here, the chaplain from the Queen's Chapel of the Savoy as well, and the Dean of the Chapels Royal, Sarah Mullally, Bishop of London. This is the Horseshoe Cloister, this red building with black beams, reconstructed by the Victorians, but making a great cloister with its guard of honour here, 3 officers and 110 rank and file from the battalion, 1st Battalion of the Grenadier Guards, who hold this ground in the front of the chapel. Sir Tony Blair, with his Garter insignia, arriving from Westminster, along with other people who've come by coach from Westminster to be here. So when I said that here at St. George's it was going to be largely household and people who were friends perhaps of the Queen and godchildren and the wider family, that's all true. But there's also, because it is still a state funeral, there are also going to be representatives who were at Westminster Abbey and who've come down here, particularly the politicians. The Prime Minister will be here. And some of the foreign royals, particularly, again, the royal families. There's always been a very close link between royal family in Britain and other royal families. For instance, the Queen of Denmark, who now is the last serving woman monarch in Europe with the death of the Queen, she will be here. The procession has now entered the Long Walk for a journey of a mile or more from here up to Windsor Castle. Led by a dismounted detachment of the Household Cavalry and these equerries escort party of the Grenadier Guards still escorting the state hearse. I can't tell you what extraordinary scenes there have been in Windsor over the last 3 days. These crowds just crammed in here to the Long Walk is just part of what has been a constant toing and froing of people coming, bringing flowers, bringing their children. As we've heard so often when people were explaining why they were visiting the lying in state at Westminster Hall, they just wanted their children to remember that they'd been there. Like people who say, I remember, or my grandfather remembers Queen Victoria's funeral, just that these moments when people want to be there so they have a memory of it. The massed pipes and drums of Scottish and Irish regiments take up the music with the skirl of the pipes and the shimmering drums. the officers of the royal household, the director of the royal collection, the master of the household, just in front of the state hearse there. The procession is now coming up a steep hill towards the castle itself, maybe why they were just slowing down a little there. See the route liners come to the salute as the front of the procession, the dismounted detachment of the household cavalry approaches them. And that's where they're headed, to that doorway, the George IV gate, between the two towers at the top of the hill. And that's where, in the quadrangle, the king and members of the royal family will join this procession, and it will turn round down to the left, to the lower ward. The heralds have marched all this way. The distinctive eagle's feathers, the Royal Company of Archers for Scotland, the velvet caps of the watermen, those blue velvet jockey caps, the watermen who used to always accompany the sovereign, and the Queen's Gurkha orderly officers just in front, the very bottom of your picture, the Gurkhas who, ever since Edward VII's coronation in 1901, were given a special place at court. huge standard, the royal standard of the Grenadier Guards Regiment, carried before the hearse, presented to the Grenadier Guards by the Sovereign at the beginning of her reign, never changed or replaced. The Queen's company colour, as it's called. It dominates this procession. It's a huge flag. But there is a moment in the service to come when a very small flag is placed on the Queen's coffin by the King just before the coffin is lowered into the vault. Not that grand standard you can see there, but something called the camp colour. Very, very small flag, which was used to denote where the commanding officer of the guards could be found, put outside his tent, hoisted where he was, and it's a symbol that the Queen was our commander. Recognize, no doubt very easily, the Skyboat song, Over the Sea to Sky, being played as the procession approaches the Cambridge Gate. There are 64 pipers and drummers playing from a whole host of regiments and battalions, from the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, the Royal Tank Regiment, the 1st Battalion Scots Guards, 1st Battalion Irish Guards, the 4th Battalion, the Royal Regiment of Scotland, the Highlanders, and the 19th Regiment of the Royal Artillery, and the Army School of Bagpipe Music. members of the Queen's household. Some in uniform, some in morning suits. Just before the Queen's colour there. Boat song, the band of the Household Cavalry plays one of the 3 Beethoven funeral marches that are being played here today and heard at the commemoration at the Cenotaph each year. Funeral marches 1, 2 and 3 by Beethoven. The Household Cavalry leading the way here. One of the oldest regiments in the British Army, dates back to the mid-17th century, made up of the Life Guards and the Blues and Royals, the 2 senior regiments of the household. And they always have the job of protecting the monarch and of taking part in the ceremonial processions in London. They provide a mounted, dismounted guard at Horse Guards. They're there at the state opening of Parliament. They're there at state banquets. Some of the horses, understandably, a little restless at this long, slow walk, but they keep them beautifully under control. Behind the hearse, the sovereign standard of the Household Cavalry. Just lost sight of it there. It was once used, like all standards, as a rallying point in battle, and are embroidered now with the battle honours of each regiment. It is a very splendid and very touching sight, this last procession for the Queen. After all the glamour of the processions in London, there's huge numbers of people. Here, this quite intimate procession, bearing the coffin of the Queen back to her home at Windsor, the place where she came every weekend if she could, where she spent her childhood years, and where she came for a month each year in the summer and at Easter, a place that she called home, and where during the pandemic she and the Duke of Edinburgh spent lockdown instead of going for Christmas to Sandringham, where they celebrated their 73rd wedding anniversary. And where, of course, she sat alone in St. George's Chapel at the funeral of her husband. Just a year ago. These are the final moments for the people to see the hearse, because once it goes inside through the gate, the Cambridge gate that leads up to the George IV gate into the quadrangle of Windsor Castle itself, there will be no members of the public. There will only be those who've come to the chapel to take part in the service. So this is quite literally the last glimpse of the sovereign's coffin that her subjects will see, except, of course, watching it on television. On left and right of this final part of the pathway, again, all these flowers are tiny bouquets of flowers that were brought here and have been laid out. And standing there on the right of the picture, the Queen's pony or horse, Emma. When the Duke of Edinburgh had his funeral here, the driving carriage that he used to use was brought out to the quadrangle. Here from the Mews of Windsor, the grooms who work in the Royal Mews, and this black Highland, I suspect, pony, Emma. Come to watch the coffin go past. It was only a few months ago that the Queen was seen riding in the park. And as many people have said today, her two great passions were horses and dogs. And it's a rather touching sight that Emma should be brought out to watch the procession go by. The mounted cavalry now peel away. They don't go through into the quadrangle. They're peeling off to the right there. And the Blues and Royals on foot. The lifeguards there with the procession as it goes through the George IV gate. These, the Queen's Company of the 1st Battalion of the Grenadier Guards, the closest to the hearse. King's Troop, Royal Horse Artillery, about to fire. They weren't renamed the Queen's Troop. There's the bell firing, the hammer on the left of it. They weren't renamed the Queen's Troop. Queen Elizabeth said they should be called the King's Troop in honor of her father, and the same thing is going to happen. The Queen's Company of the 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards, who are the closest escort here for Her Majesty's coffin, are going to retain the name the Queen's Company in honor of Her Majesty. Two of the Queen's corgis, like Emma the pony, Sandy and Mick. The Queen was famous, I don't know how many corgis she had, 50 or 60 I think in her life. But they've been brought out here just to the right of the arch as the cortege comes into the quadrangle, the private part of the palace. It'll go round and be joined by the King and members of the royal family at the state entrance. The familiar figures by now in this procession. King on the left, Princess Royal, the Duke of Kent, Prince Edward on the far right, the Duke of York in the centre, not in uniform, Princess Royal and the King coming out, the Duke of Sussex behind, the Duke of Gloucester behind him. And Vice Admiral Sir Tim Lawrence on the far right. The male members of the royal family and the Princess Royal. The other female members of the royal family will travel by car down to St. George's Chapel, not march in this procession. Prince of Wales towering above Princess Royal. Duke of Sussex passing through. Peter Phillips there. And the Earl of Snowdon as well in this procession. They're going through the archway of the Norman Tower, and that will take them round to the left and down the steep hill into what's called the lower ward of the castle, which is where St. George's Chapel is. the lower ward, the lower fortification. Historically, there's a lower ward, a middle ward, and an upper ward when this place was first fortified. The procession is on its way down towards the west door of St. George's Chapel. And there there'll be this very simple service of committal, all agreed with Her Majesty the Queen, much discussed, the service taken by the Dean of Windsor. And it contains psalms, the Russian Kantakin of the departed, hymns, a reading, a bidding, prayers, more hymns, and then the committal itself, with this coffin being lowered in front of the altar until it disappears from sight. And the Queen's piper will play a lament, and the Garter King of Arms will read out the styles and titles of the Queen. And the regalia presented at the coronation will be removed and put on the high altar. And the Queen's company camp collar will be placed on the coffin by the King, and the Lord Chamberlain will break his wand in half and put it too on the coffin. Everyone standing in silence as the coffin is lowered. The Dean of Windsor will say the committal from Psalm 103, and then the well-known words, "Go forth upon thy journey from this world, O Christian soul." And a final blessing, as everyone stands, will be given by the Archbishop of Canterbury. A very simple, straightforward, moving ceremony that brings the Queen's body to lie beside the bodies of her mother and her father and her husband and her sister in the George VI chapel, newly built on the side of the St. George's Chapel. The hearse enters the Horseshoe Cloister and stops in front of the steps that lead up to the west door of St George's Chapel. And the bearer party will come out from the right. These young men who have carried this coffin from Westminster Hall, carried it down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, and now for the last time will carry it up the steps into St George's Chapel, where it will, at the end of the service, be laid to rest.
Guard and escort party. Royal suit. Present. Up.
The Earl Marshal and the Lord Chamberlain precede the coffin up the steps in loving and devoted memory.
Habari za saa. Jiji letu.
Hapa na pale.
Habari saa 2 na saa 5 usiku. Habari hizo zote unazipata mubashara kupitia Facebook
@ITV Tanzania
na YouTube
ITV Tanzania.
Zote ni kiganjani mwako, kompyuta na kompyuta mpakato. ITV daima, super brand Afrika Mashariki.
Je, una ndoto za kufanikiwa kwenye kada ya utabibu na una